Welcome. I am Sister Who. With me today on the show, I have my friend Val Stepien,
Yes.
and we wanted to talk about the issue, the personal life event, the significance of what might be called coming out.
Mm-hmm.
This step of personal growth and societal disclosure where you publicly claim who and what you are, which I suppose is in the last few decades has been most obviously framed within gay and lesbian populations, but could apply to a lot of others as well.
It can.
Because it's basically someone who is anomalous or different or unique from the majority of the population, who chooses not to be the silent elephant in the living room anymore, but to say, I am who and what I am, and this is what I am, and I'm not trying to make an issue of it, but I want you to know this so that I can be who and what I am in the same relaxed, normal way that you are. I mean, we're basically talking about the elimination of double standards.
Right. Yeah, and normal, whatever that is, right?
I sometimes joke normal is a setting on the washing machine.
Right.
But
sometimes broken.
sometimes it's broken. But but there are, society has its norms.
Indeed.
Anywhere and always, and there's nothing especially wrong with that. But it's when the norms become exclusive that we begin to have what you might call marginalized populations.
Right. That's when it becomes a problem.
When people think that they don't have the right to be different. At the office, if you work in an office or a factory or anywhere, and they decide they're going to have a social activity for the employees, and the announcement goes out, bring your wife or bring your husband. Well, what about the people who don't have wives or husbands? Well, single people are welcome too. Well, what if the guy has a husband and the wife has a wife, or the woman has a wife?
The presumption of heterosexuality is rampant.
It is rampant.
Yeah.
And it's completely unnoticed until somebody questions it.
Exactly.
The problem with this assumption being rampant, is that it discourages people from speaking up when they are the exception.
Yep.
And in that way, it's encouraging dishonest relationships.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience like that in a job setting. I worked in a health care setting, and everyone was very open with the patients when they would ask, sometimes the patients would be tired of it being about them, so they would ask the healthcare provider things about themselves. And so I decided that I didn't want to be closeted in that regard. So if anybody asked me anything, like who's your husband, would be a question that would come up. And I'd say, well, actually my partner is a woman, and then I'd answer the question. Whatever they're asking, what does your husband do? I would just inform them and then continue to answer the question. And I was called in by my supervisor, who had heard of this, and she said to me, and she was a lesbian, so this was especially interesting.
Okay.
And she said to me, you can't come out to patients. And I said, and why would that be? And she said, because it can make people uncomfortable, and they're here for their healthcare reasons, not to get liberated. And I said, when you tell the other healthcare staff not to talk about their husbands, because it was predominantly females working there, I said, then I'll stop talking about my partner. I said, but if the standard is that if anyone asks you, and you're straight, tell me about your husband, and you say, I'm sorry, I can't talk about my husband, I said, then maybe I could comply with it, but that's not how it is. So it's an interesting thing that can happen.
Was the supervisor willing to respect you were basically pointing out a double standard.
Right.
Double standards are always problematic. They cause more problems, they don't create solutions.
Yes.
They leave someone feeling like a second-class citizen. And there's always the possibility that the patient is gay or lesbian, and that it will actually make them feel more at ease to have one less thing they need to hide.
Yeah, and I had everything. I've had people who were at ease where that happened. Of course, it's a minority because we are the minority. But I've also had someone who was quite an elderly gentleman who I was hesitant, but I decided to stick with my my values. a man in his, older man in his late 80s.
Okay.
And he asked me, "So you married?" And I said, "Well, actually, my partner's a woman, and if I could be married, I would, and right now I can't be." And I was tense as I said it because I had this assumption that elderly white gentleman was going to be really uncomfortable with that. And he looked at me and he put his hand on his hip. He goes, "You're kidding! I never would have guessed. How about that? So how long you been together?" And he was just very comfortable. And and then I had another situation that was very difficult. A woman I'd worked with for a couple of years who had a very adverse reaction to that kind of a conversation. But she didn't want to process it, but she ended up finding her own way to work it out with me. So kind of
Well,
had
I'm
all.
glad it was resolved. I suppose one way, when you run into someone who is uncomfortable, would be to simply shift to a neutral discussion of, well, do you think everyone should keep their personal lives absolutely private? You know, and to shift the discussion to what should be the standard. And still assuming, if you will, that there should not be double standards.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. I'll have to keep that in mind.
You know, if someone says that they're uncomfortable with it, well, how much of their personal lives do you think, you know, caregiving staff should disclose? You know, because we should all have a fair world to live in, right? I mean,
Should be the
what's
same.
good for you should be good for me, and vice versa.
Yeah.